Welcome to part 2 of the 2020 East Bay Leadership Series. My name is Kristen Connolly. I'm the President and CEO of the East Bay Leadership Council. Thank you for joining us today. The East Bay Leadership Council is a regional public policy advocacy organization representing hundreds of employers in Contra Costa and Alameda counties. Our mission is to improve economic vitality and quality of life. Our ability to host thought-provoking discussions like we will have today depends on our members and on our sponsors. Before we get started with our program today, I want to thank the sponsors of the 2020 East Bay Leadership Series. The first major sponsor, Chevron Richmond Refinery. Our second major sponsor, Martinez Refining Company. Next, I would like to thank our event's 5 sustaining sponsors, John Muir Health, Kaiser Permanente, Marathon Petroleum, St. Mary's College, and Shelter Inc. The contributing sponsors this year's series are CEMEX, Contra Costa Water District, Contra Costa Association of Realtors, IBEW Local 302, and Miller Star Regalia. We also are supported at the contributing sponsor level by the Oakland Athletics, Lennar, Phillips 66, Safeway, Western States Petroleum Association, Wells Fargo, and the Contra Costa Workforce Development Board. In addition to all the organizations that sponsor this event series, the council created an opportunity for its board members to be community leader sponsors. They are listed on the screen, and I am so grateful for their support and leadership. Finally, I want to take a minute to thank the elected officials from our region who are participating in today's discussion. Their names are up on the screen. It's entirely possible that there are others listening in, and we're thrilled to, but these elected officials let us know that they were coming. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. So without further ado, I want to get started on today's important discussion. Conor Dougherty is an economics reporter at the New York Times. His work focuses on the West Coast, real estate, wage stagnation among U.S. workers. Mr. Dougherty has covered economics and real estate on and off for a decade at both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Before that, he worked at the San Diego Union Tribune and the Los Angeles Business Journal. He lives in Oakland and is a Bay Area native. It's really great to have an East Bay leader among us. Several people involved with the East Bay Leadership Council's Housing Task Force highly anticipated the release of Conor's book in February, Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America, which is why we reached out to Conor to do this program, which is the second part of our 2020 East Bay Leadership Series. Our format for today is we're going to have Conor give 10 minutes or so of opening remarks before we dive into a moderated Q&A session. I know all of our members are joining me in welcoming you to today's program in their own way. So thank you for joining us. Conor, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Well, I've done so many Q&As that I'm never exactly sure how to begin, but I think one of the things that I think is, anyway, thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for being here. As I'm sure everyone is, I once did a story about a talk radio host years and years and years ago, and someone said to me, he has a tough time making sense of reality because he sits in this room talking to this microphone and he's not sure if anyone's there or if anyone's listening. And I feel like these Zoom conferences things are kind of like that, where I'm used to being in a room and you see the audience. But anyway, even in this forum, thank you everyone for being here. I've been doing a lot of talks on Zoom, and I had about 2.5 weeks of traditional book tour. And one of the things that I found kind of interesting, but also a little maddening, is that whenever I go somewhere, people kind of move very quickly past the generalities of the book, the things that we can learn no matter who we are or where we live, and dive real deep into some local development fight or some landlord that angered them or something that is very specific to their life. And I think what sometimes it's frustrating because in the Q&A, people will ask about something that is so hyper specific that it's hard to adequately respond to. But on the other hand, everyone has a story. Everyone has some development issue or housing thing that is so personal to them and so specific to them that they feel compelled to show up to these things and just tell you about it. And it does make me appreciate how important and all-encompassing this topic is. Everyone, as my agent said when I first pitched the book, everyone has a parent and a home. And even homeless people. I've spent a lot of time in homeless encampments. They do have what you would kind of call a home. They do create a space. So this book, I think, began really with a question, which is, why, if everyone agrees on the solutions to this problem, has nothing happened? So 40 years ago, a guy, as I wrote it in the book, this book came out describing the Bay Area. It was called The Environmental Protection Hustle, which, despite its Fox News title, was a very reasonable and kind of balanced book. And this book kind of laid out that the Bay Area had this huge housing problem, that had a huge jobs housing imbalance, and that in many ways people's reaction to the housing problem ran counter to their stated values. That you would see environmentalists basically pushing for sprawl, that you would see people worried about social justice essentially pushing for segregation. And no matter how many, what was fascinating to me is that this was said in 1979, and you would hear it when this book was published, and you hear these same things over and over and over again in the same solutions, which is some version of build more housing and try to find a way to build more affordable housing for people who can't afford what the private developer is building. Everyone seemed to understand what the problem was, that it was a big problem. Everyone seemed to have some, like 80% agreement on what the solutions were. And yet, for 40 years, same problem. And there had been numerous times that legislation was passed. Jerry Brown passed a huge housing package in 1981, but it didn't seem to have done much for us. And so I guess what I found fascinating about it was, maybe this isn't a problem of legislation. Maybe this isn't a problem of figuring out what the right solution is. Maybe this is just a problem in us. Maybe there is something inherently in us that makes it really difficult to accept change around us, and that we would have to work through those kind of more sociological things before we could ever really get to really making progress on solving it. And so the book is really rooted in these people. The main character, one of the main characters, is this woman, Sonia Trout, who started this group called the Bay Area Renters Federation, or BARF. And she went from this high school teacher kind of taking her lunchtime off or taking days off to go to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors and complain about the lack of housing at public comment, to becoming a political candidate and building this whole organization. You can trace the organization Sonia built right to one of the guys who was showing up to meetings with her in that very early stage where she was just a high school teacher, was this guy, Brian Hanlon, who's gone on to start this group, California YIMBY, that pretty much wrote SB 50, which is, of course, this big upzoning bill in California last year. And so that's one story. But then there's another story of a 15-year-old girl who comes home one day and finds an $800 rent increase posted to her door. and despite no real background in activism, becomes basically a tenant organizer and is really leading this whole building of adults against this landlord. And then you meet a nun who's kind of quietly become this multimillionaire real estate investor, where she goes and buys apartment buildings and then tries to convert them to affordable housing, and has found herself facing off against private equity funds for the same properties. And then you meet a city manager in Lafayette, kind of a bureaucrat, a non-elected person who runs a planning department. And these people are people who kind of sit in the middle and really implement a lot of the decisions that people make legislatively, but finds himself squeezed between one group of people that want more density in his city and another group of people who want less, and sort of tries to find this middle ground, and in doing so gets sued by both sides. So I think that what I really wanted to do, kind of wrapping up before we get into the Q&A, is tell a story that was rooted in people, that would make you want to turn the pages, but would also capture, that would get away from prognosticating and instead center itself in this question: if everybody knows what to do, and if all the solutions are pretty well agreed upon, why can't we get there? That seemed like a more essential question. And so I think this book, I would say that the book answers it. It doesn't answer it in a satisfying way. The answer is, like, it's hard, because living near people and building cities and living in a changing world is hard. It's never been easy. It's never going to be easy. But figuring it out is, each little bit at a time, and making some amount of progress with each generation pretty much is the definition of progress, for humanity. So it is a struggle. It is the struggle, but we don't have to solve it. We just have to demonstrate that we're making progress. And I think that over the past 4 or 5 years, the conversation has radically changed around housing, and that alone is a huge victory and a huge marker of progress. And hopefully, it just kind of continues from there.
Terrific opening. I'm excited. We have some questions that are starting to come in. I've got a few that we'll get to some of those in a second. But I do think that you very much succeeded in talking about important policy issues by having them rooted in stories. So, when you're writing about Sonia or writing about Stephanie, the teenager, or who, by the way, I appreciate that you only interviewed when her parent was around. So for those of you who, our assumption here is that some of you have read the book, but many of you haven't. So one of our first questions that we'll get to in a second, but is about your thoughts about how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted things. And I'll let you think about that for a second. But I did want to go to, I do think it's really important that you draw out some of the historical evolution of how things have evolved in California, and about when things used to be easy, and how there was a time when someone making a far more modest salary could own a home. So I wanted to know if you could just dive in a little bit to tell a little bit about the Prop 14 backlash and some of the things that were happening when California was actually out in front of the country in terms of civil rights and access to housing, and how that has impacted your thoughts about where housing is today.
So we'll get into this, but let's just start with the operating principle of when people show up in a new place and build kind of a city from scratch, if you will, or from very little. That's a process that's happened many times in this country, and it is often remembered as the heyday of the place in that particular place. Mm-hmm. And so we do repeat this cycle. You hear all these stories. Oh, people were going to California in the 60s and 70s, and we'll get into that, right? But now you hear these stories. Oh, everyone's going to Phoenix and Dallas. I assure you that we will we are already, but we will soon be hearing in 10, 20 years, people are leaving Phoenix because it's too big and complicated, right? So this, and maybe not, but I just meant there is a kind of easiness in going to a field and saying, let's build a city here, that is different than going to a fully built, very complicated city and saying, let's change this above the protests of all the people who are already there. So, and I think that just kind of beginning with that framework, I think that's really important to think about, because this is a challenge that nobody has ever really, not in America anyway, totally figured out. It's going, places that are really big and complicated are just like simply more difficult to change. It's kind of like the proverbial boat that, you have to really pull the steering wheel to get an inch of movement, right? So anyway, California obviously had a gigantic boom after World War II. And it was a huge, we really built the post-war suburbs. I mean, suburbs obviously existed before then, but they became the predominant form of living in that time. We built all the freeways. And this is why Pat Brown, Jerry Brown's dad, is kind of remembered as this master builder who built more freeways than anybody else. He created the biggest public works project, the California Water Project ever at that time. And all that, I think they built like a high school a day or something like that. Or there was all these stories about how much demand there was and how great the life was. But I think people went too far. There was famously, they wanted to fill in the San Francisco Bay. In LA and various other places, they were concerned about agriculture and, what was going to be left if everything was going to be just tract homes everywhere. And so there was, at the same time that this was happening, the kind of older core cities like San Francisco were basically, people were trying to turn them into suburbs. You have projects like Geary Boulevard, which is ugly. Sorry, people who live on Geary. And you have, obviously there was redevelopment projects that were horribly racist. And on top of that, people didn't even like what they were doing. So except for things like BART. But what I think, it just led to a backlash and just a basic distrust of developers, one that was not unfounded. This all kind of crystallized with the Embarcadero Freeway, which, if everyone here remembers, ran in front of the ferry building. They actually had plans to take it down before the earthquake, but the earthquake is what kind of did it in. And so I guess the premise of my book is basically that's like the foundation, but then there was a backlash. Now, as you alluded to, that backlash manifested in some pretty racist things. California passed a very progressive fair housing law in 1963. It's still 5 years before fair housing was passed in the 1968 Civil Rights Act. And on top of that, there's some evidence, I would have to get into, that the California law was even more effective. It had a much better enforcement system and whatever. And so there was a backlash vote in which basically more than 60% of voters voted to not only repeal that law, but to encode in the Constitution a law that would have essentially made it legal to discriminate in the sale or rent of housing. That even if you set up a policy that said you may not rent this house to a Black person, like that would be legal. So that was quickly thrown out in the Constitution, but it at least told you where people were at that time, that California was not nearly as progressive as it was painting itself off as being, and that housing was the real crystallization of this, because in that same election that Prop 14 passed, Californians overwhelmingly voted for Lyndon Johnson, who was running on kind of a civil rights platform at that time. And so what that tells me isn't necessarily that people, and this has been studied by various political scientists, is that when you get to the home, things are just much more difficult, that people will vaguely be for things that seem like the right things, civil rights and or economic growth or whatever, at some national level. But then when you really ask them, what are you going to do near you, or what are you for in your backyard, as it is, their answer changes. And so that's kind of why I said in my opening remarks, I just kind of come back to, there is something innate in this that is really hard. And changing these conversations one little move at a time feels like the only real way we're going to get there. So the first, if you have a question, I can answer, but I was just going to say, the first time I met Sonia Traus, we met at a cafe in Oakland. And I had met her because Jeremy Stoppelman, who's the co-founder and CEO of Yelp, told me he was giving money to her. And I thought, that's odd, because she seemed off kilter. And she showed up at a cop car. It was a orange Crown Victoria that she'd bought used, and it was like bright orange, and it had like glitter in the paint. And she walks in a fluorescent outfit with like a vintage 80s heavy metal sweatshirt on. And in the course of our conversation, she said to me numerous times, it doesn't really matter how much you pass the law. I mean, I'll work for that. That's like important. And people really don't want it. And if you don't really have people, if it's always people are going to fight like crazy in their town, on their block, whatever, it won't really matter. And she made a great point. She said to me, look, if everyone wanted a lot more housing in California right now, we could just have that tomorrow with very little change in the law. There wouldn't be any CEQA lawsuit problem, because there wouldn't be any CEQA lawsuits. There wouldn't be, so these laws if you think about the policy conversation in California today, it's almost like attempting to usurp that, but if everyone just felt differently, there wouldn't be a need to change the law in the first place. So I'm not trying to say that in a Pollyannish way. I'm more trying to say it as, I think the social conversation and what I've observed in the book of this younger generation being much more interested in building housing, I think that turns out to be much more important than any particular law.
Right. No, political will in all of this really matters a lot. Okay, so since you sort of went down the housing policy track, we are a policy organization. When I was reading, the chapter about Senator Scott Wiener, in particular, his very hardworking and incredibly capable lead staff on housing, Annie Fryman, that resonated a lot in terms of what my experience has been. I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about, what you think of the current state of play. There's a whole chapter you write about the housing package and Senator Wiener's approach of just outworking his opponents. And having the hardest working staff in order to just sort of stay on it. It's something he's still working on. What did you learn about sort of the California housing, legislative situation? And what's important for people like us who think that the lack of housing is a real drag on the economy? What should we know about the current state of play and what you think needs to happen next?
So I'll just start by saying I've mostly covered economics. And so it was actually really, even though I've been a reporter for 20 years, it was really interesting to see how politicians worked. You think about politics your whole life, vaguely, like, oh, I understand that there's a president and whatever. But as a reporter, I've not really experienced it. So it was new to me in some ways. A lot of reporters kind of begin, or at least touch politics in some way at some point in their career, but I never really had. I'd always covered business. I started at the LA Business Journal, a small newspaper in LA, and I've worked at the business section in the San Diego Union Tribune, and then the Wall Street Journal, and then the business section in the New York Times. So I have always been more rooted in the business and economics mindset. So one thing I would just say as an aside, I really realized after meeting a bunch of different political people and this is sort of self-evident, but I just didn't really get it for myself, that politicians are basically just people who are good at getting elected to things, that's like their primary skill. And whether or not they're going to be good at the job is not only is it not clear, there's nothing in running for the job that tells you if they'll be good at it. It's almost like just a lottery, whether or not the person will actually be good at what the job in theory entails.
Right.
And what was fascinating to me about Scott Wiener is he actually was just really good at the job. There were other, and I'm not saying that means I necessarily agree with him or anything, or that anybody else should. I'm more just saying, like, he's got what he wants, and he like is going to get close to what he wants. You know, there are other people I met who I shall remain in who just like weren't that good at it. You know, they were people who, you might have agreed with them. You might have even thought they had great luck, but they were just kind of like lazy. You know, it's like this kind of human element turns out to like really matter. So I was impressed by learning that here's this guy who just like works really hard, and that's like turns out to be that, you know, like if you're fighting over, okay, I have 50% of what I want and I just want to get to 65. But then you add that up over bill and bill and bill, you know, like it turns out to be significant. And so I actually was really impressed by the degree to which just having that one person be in that particular job turned out to be like important. And there might be other people you could point to who might have had totally different visions, but they might just be like sort of lazy and not get, you know. And so I don't know. I just will say that is one thing I actually thought to myself, I wonder if there would be a way to report on this. I'm kind of freestyling here, but you know, like, how do you show like who's actually like good at a thing? You know,
Right.
you have all these measures of CEOs and stock price. I mean, and we could argue whether or not those are even good measures, but they exist. Whereas like, I don't really know. At least I've, even as a reporter, I've not popularly seen like, how do I even tell if someone's like good at this job? Anyway.
Yeah, because a scorecard from an interest group doesn't cut it in terms of actually acknowledging if they're good at governing. And
honestly, the interest groups, the people I think are the best at I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, to be good at politics, you have to be basically suicidal. You have to be willing to do things that will potentially threaten your job. That's crazy. I don't threaten my job on a daily basis. I do things that push the envelope or whatever with my boss, but I'm certainly not doing things that I think legitimately could get me fired. Whereas to be an interesting politician, I think you basically do have to do that. So it's, and one thing that impressed me about Senator Wiener is it seemed like, I mean, he has angered a lot of people in his district with some of his stuff. And, you know, he just seems to live with it. So you asked about the policy conversation. There's a housing package that's probably going to pass soon, some version of it. It's much less ambitious than what was there before. But I think that all these things that have passed over the past few years may amount to something over time. And if they don't amount to something, I think it might be because of that kind of sociological thing that we were talking about, which I, like I said, I've really come to believe is the most important thing. Because, so for instance, the New York Times and a bunch of other people did a big article when Minneapolis, about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago now, became the first major city in America to essentially eliminate single-family zoning with a law that would allow triplex apartments on any parcel in the city. So that was a big national story. People thought it was a huge shift for urban America, and other cities have done similar things. Nancy Skinner basically just passed a law like that for the whole state of California last year. It's a law that will allow people to build ADUs in the back and then split their homes into 2 units. So somebody could, in theory, start doing that. There's been a million other ADU laws passed at the local, state, city level. So if all of those things happen and we I lost you, but I was talking about ADU laws and all the little things.
Yeah.
If all those things happened and it made no difference, we didn't. So if we see an ADU building boom, if we see a duplex and triplex building boom, I think that we can then say, okay, well, that happened. Maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe it didn't come close to solving a problem, but that happened. I mean, I live in Rockridge. If any of Rockridge in Oakland, so if any of that happened in my neighborhood, it'd be like a tripling of the density of my neighborhood. You would see tons more people at my block party on Taft Avenue. So, our water balloon toss would have to go 2 rows instead of 1. You would see it, right? And if that happens, then we'll know that happened, right? Yeah. And if that happens and it's not enough, fine. But if that doesn't happen, if we see no ADUs, if we see no triplexes, if it's just like, yeah, they passed that law and nothing happened, I suppose some large multifamily developers will probably then stand up and say, well, it's because we, only passed these laws and large multifamily is what we need. But I'm not so sure, because I went to Vancouver for an ADU story a couple of years ago when I was at the Wall Street Journal, and you could just look down. They call them laneway homes there because they have these alleys behind the homes there where they put all the trash and electrical, and they're called laneways. And you could, because the entrances are all, and you could see like 8 of them just if you looked down the alley. So I think that if we do start to see those laws take hold and result in new and different kinds of housing, that will be a progress. That will be a sign of progress. And on top of that, it'll be a nice way for people to acclimate. Because if I built an ADU and my neighbor, who's, shall we say, not pro-development, got to know our tenant, he's not going to hate them. You know what I mean? Like, you would just get used to it. So
there's a reason. The reason it's called gentle infill. I mean, on that point, right? I mean, that's how some people refer to it.
And so I guess what I'm saying is there's a lot on the books now. Let's see how they work, and let's see about fine tuning them. And I say this not because I'm advocating for it. I'm saying it more because, like, if you're really trying to solve the problem and you passed a bunch of laws and they literally do very little or nothing, then you don't only even have to, yes, maybe you should ask if you should pass different, bigger laws, but you might also ask if, like, changing laws really, if the law is really the impediment here.
Right. So I wanted to get back to one of the first questions that was submitted, which is from Daniel Kagan, who asks about how COVID-19 might affect the dynamics of our housing crisis, just explicitly. I mean, you had a book, like you said, you had kind of a hot minute of a normal book tour. And then obviously we've been dealing with this really serious pandemic that's now claimed more than 100,000 lives, and we have 100,000 cases in California. So do you have any thoughts about how this is going to change the dynamic on the housing crisis?
Yes. I'm going to read for you real quick a couple lines from John King at the San Francisco Chronicle that I think can say it better than I would say it. I don't know how many of you guys subscribe to the Chronicle, but he says in his column from May 24th, depending on which supposedly omniscient source you prefer, the specter of a lethal virus that can be transmitted by air or a simple handshake signals the end to densities once and for all, or a chance to return to the creative, inclusive urban ideal. It proves the value of the private automobile or the essential importance of public transit. Just like political punditry, experts are happy to explain how the current crisis proves the point they've been making all along. But if the past 120 years of urban history are any indication, much of what we are hearing will turn out to be irrelevant or wrong.
Yeah.
I think that not that much will change. I think not that much will change because density is not a preference. It's not even it's a preference for some people. It's an economic reality for others. I always say to people, I keep hearing this thing, everybody's going to move to the suburbs. I'm like, okay, what suburbs are those everybody going to move to? Where are they going to build the housing for that everybody? Are they going to have to build roads for that everybody? Are those roads going to be miraculously free of traffic? How close are they going to put those houses together? Will they have all independent sewer lines? Who's going to pay for all this? So it turns out that density is something we do. I mean, the world is not lacking in space. As I say in the intro of the book, just look out an airplane window the next time you're flying somewhere, and you will see that there's, I think all of humanity could fit into Texas. With just like, if you built one like duplex type city, all of humanity could live in Texas. So I think that density exists partly because it's an economic imperative. It's the ways in which people relate to each other at some like fundamental level, and the economy is just like an expression of that, right? Like people get together to exchange ideas, to meet new people, to farm, to survive, right? And when we build dense buildings, we're doing it because the value of that land is quite high. Anyway, I guess what I'm saying is that I just feel like that we severely overestimate the degree to which choice is playing a role in any of this.
Right.
We get we have a certain amount of resources in the world, and we try to use them best we can, whether it's our own personal money or just the GDP of the country. And we tend to do those things, somewhat efficiently. And that efficiency results in like more people living near each other because it's just like harder to pump water to a million places, right? As a complete aside, have you ever looked at how much power generation in California is just moving water from north to south? Like we would never do that again, because that's like the kind of stuff you have to do. Like nobody would ever do that again, because it was like a stupid decision. Sorry, that makes me sound like the biggest Northern Californian, but it's like, that's like quite something. How many times can you continue to do that?
Yeah, no, I have spirited conversations with my colleagues from the southern part of this, my counterparts at organizations in the South about water all the time. And we have a very robust water task force. But
I'm not saying that we should just, drain LA all of a sudden, but I am saying that if you think about the amount of resources we put toward building homes where people supposedly wanted to live, and if you think about how much of the state's money, power generation is just dedicated to just moving that water around, how many times can you continue to do that? Like there's a reason that density happens, and it's just cheaper. And so I always say to people, I can see a world in which every single thing falls apart and we're all hunting and foraging and wearing bandoliers and we're like the cast of The Walking Dead. And I can see a world in which we all go back to normal. But I cannot see a world in which we maintain our current standard of living or anything close to it on Zoom. I think that so much of our economic growth is tied to this to density. I mean, you can explain the past century which is the most remarkable century like in the history of humankind, by just density alone, and you can explain the rise of China and India by urbanization almost alone, right? So there's a reason this happens, and I just simply don't. And I think people will work at home more. I think there will be more telecommuting, but will that be the like predominant feature? And will people? I just don't think so. And I don't think so, not because I think people won't like it, although that too. I just don't think it will produce as much. I do not think it will be as efficient. I do not think companies will do as well under that paradigm.
So there's so much in your book and so many specific things that I could ask about. I think that there's sort of an appetite to think about specific ways we can move forward, right? So for example, you mentioned the 299 unit St. Francis housing co-op, right? Which is funded by a union and a pension fund. And as we're thinking about how to work on a housing crisis at a time when public budgets are really really strained, I'm thinking about how we can use some of these resources you've talked about, natural resources and land that public agencies have at their disposal. Are there lessons from your research that you think are important to highlight in this moment about how to move forward in terms of, building housing creatively? Because you talk about the deals that are done to create value where none existed, and what's interesting about land. So wanted to sort of give you an opportunity to talk about some of those specifics.
Yeah, so thanks for that. I do not, I probably didn't spend as much time on that kind of stuff as I could in the book, partly because I really try to get away from stories that have a lot of coulds and mays in them, it's like, I feel like my value is in describing what's happening. And why and what it looks like. And it's not to say that people with big ideas aren't important, because you of course need that. But I find my value is highest when I'm documenting what's really happening and that sort of thing. So with all that said, probably the most provocative thing I read is there's a book, very wonky book, but if you guys want to pick it up, called The Public Wealth of Nations. And there's a guy named Dag Detter, Dagdetter. If you Google him, you will find his website, and he runs a consulting business. But the basic premise of this book and his business, and just, I'm a journalist, so I got to start with, he's selling something, so kick the tires on it as hard as you can kick them. But is that we have trillions of dollars in public assets that we just aren't using. I mean, how many buildings does the county of San Francisco own? How many buildings does the LA city own, or the state of California own? And what are they doing with those buildings? Could they redevelop them? Could they put 3 floors of housing on the top of those? Could they raise the building and build something 3 times as high? Right? Like what, and that's just buildings. I mean, how much empty land is there near, various train stops? How much, some of it's Superfund sites and stuff. So clearly you can't do much with that. But my point being that there's so much unused value just in land, but it's also in other assets that states could manage professionally. Now, I want to make one important point. I'm not talking about privatizing for profit.
Right.
And that's not because I think for profit is some evil thing or whatever, but just because I don't think selling those assets is a good idea either. I'm more talking about, I guess the structure I'm thinking of is something like an endowment fund, where you create an independent board so that it's not politically controlled. So that is important, but it's also run for the public's benefit in some way. And I think that an experiment like that using would be a really good idea, because I think that you could probably really expand services without spending a lot on taxes. And again, it's not that I'm super against taxes or anything. I'm more just saying, anyway, so I actually thought that book and that concept, how do we better manage our public resources, just more efficiently, as well as in a way that departments start creating their own revenue, like the Federal Reserve does, which is the Federal Reserve is funded by its own. It's obviously has $1 trillion. So just, that's not a great example, but it's an example. And then they give the excess to the Treasury. So I think that, why couldn't the library system run like a little business that generates revenue within their thing? Again, maybe I'm being a little Pollyannish, but I think even if everyone couldn't do it, someone could, or they, there is a place where this model might work. And it seems like it's at least worth experimenting with or thinking about on a small scale. So, as you alluded to in the book, one of the things I thought was fascinating was there is this project that I pointed to, a project in Oakland, and this developer, Rick Holiday, went and bought a piece of land from Caltrans, and he then went to the city of Oakland and said, I want to build this affordable, I want to build this housing project here, and I'm going to have a third of it will be affordable, and 50 of those will be supportive housing, for homeless people, which is, a much different thing than even affordable housing, which
Right.
affordable housing, once you build it, does return something, but the supportive housing requires an ongoing commitment. And then he used basically the money from the value created for the market rate units to subsidize the affordable units. So I just kind of thought, like you said, I was like, okay, here you have a piece of state land at a time in which the state is passing billions of dollars in bonds to build affordable housing. And then you have a city that, just has a meeting basically to rezone it. And out of that comes millions of dollars that was sitting there untapped, that can be spent on supportive housing units. And so I just thought to myself, there's got to be a way for cities to do more of that themselves. And I'm not saying they should manage it themselves. In fact, I'm decidedly saying the opposite. Right. But I think that this concept, what kinds of resources are we just like, what vast amounts of money are we just like not taking advantage of? And I should say there are, plenty of other places, Singapore, places in Europe that do things like this. We are never going to be them. So I do kind of, I try to like gently point the comparisons to other countries, because I'm skeptical of the whole, like, can't we all just be like Europe? I mean, right. But, maybe we should look to things like what they're doing out in, there's a public house. There's something San Francisco is doing with public land out in the Balboa Reservoir. So maybe we should use our own examples, but we should just, I think that we could, I gotta believe that the basic premise that the government has a lot more value than it's tapping, that the government owns a lot of stuff, a lot of money, and that it's managing it incompetently, like those two things do not seem unbelievable to me.
Well, I wanted to, I'm mindful of time. There's a lot of questions. I wanted to go to a question from Eric Zell, who says, thanks for the conversation, Conor. What are your best ideas, financial or otherwise, to compel residents, NIMBYs, to accept density post-COVID? Because I'm trying to get the idea across that there's a difference between overcrowding, and you tell that story about what it's like for a family of four to live in a crowded one-bedroom apartment, especially when mom and dad are divorced. Very visual how you write it. But this NIMBY dynamic is real. What do you say to Eric's question?
So I always come back to, I only think you can do so much. And it's not to say that you shouldn't try. You show up to the meetings, you dutifully go through your presentation, you treat the concerns with respect and, care, and you say, well, actually, we have a lot of evidence that shows that buildings don't gentrify neighborhoods in the case of that concern, or we have a lot of evidence that, traffic is not. So people in Lafayette constantly complain about the 24. And I saw this one guy at a meeting once was like, go follow those people in your car one day. You'll see that they're passing Lafayette and going out to, as far as you want to go. At Sacramento in some cases, they're going up 680 to Napa or wherever. There's that whole development being built up there. So along the roadside there. So and so tell people, do all the stuff, but then you got to kind of just. I guess what I'm saying is that in a lot of these talks, people ask me what is the thing that quote works, and I don't have an answer other than keeping at it and then deciding, well, we're at an impasse and we're going to try to get this done. Traditionally, the way it's worked in development is these community benefit agreements, which are, basically they say, I'll give you something, whether it's a park or whatever. I'm sure developers are tired of doing that, but that seems to be a piece of how it's worked in the past. Regarding COVID, I would say there is huge evidence that COVID is more a function of overcrowding and less a function of
density.
Yeah. And so in Chicago, in East Palo Alto, in all these different places, you can see areas that are actually quite low density have the higher concentration. So California, and so anyway, and in Manhattan, the COVID infections are quite low, but in Queens, they're quite high. And so anyway, my point is that you can make all these points, you can show all this evidence, whether it's about COVID or about density or about traffic or about gentrification or about any of these things. But then you have to kind of decide you're not going to get there. So then you just go into it and try to, I was saying to someone the other day that it's kind of like telling someone that you're about to get a shot. If you tell someone, well, it's not going to hurt. Have you ever seen someone go, oh, well, thank you. Great. I'm not worried about it now. Right. So, that there's only so much you can do. You're dealing with this like really fundamental human thing, which is like the fear of the unknown. And the way our brains work is we tell ourselves stories about what we don't know. And this tortures us. This is the root of anxiety. And people are going to tell themselves a story about what's going to be on the empty lot. And there's nothing you can really do to change that story in their head beyond what you're already doing. And then I don't know.
Yeah. Well, okay. So there's too many things. I made a whole bingo card of all the things from your book I wanted to ask you about, and we're not going to get there in the next 7 minutes. But I do think that there's interest and because those of us who care deeply about expanding opportunity and making sure that we think about quality of life really broadly, and it's not lost that you talk about California's 130,000 homeless people, and that number is growing. And I was wondering about what what you learned the most about homelessness as an issue. You spent time with people without shelter. You referenced it at the top about how people, even without a traditional, they will put together a home for themselves in an encampment. And and there's been a lot of change in the COVID pandemic on a temporary basis for putting homeless people in hotels and things. And I just wanted to give you a chance to comment on homelessness and what your research revealed about that whole issue.
So I will start by saying we are blessed. Well, blessed is probably the wrong word, but we have some of the greatest homeless experts in America here. Margot Cashel at UC San Francisco is like this, world famous person on homelessness. And so there's a lot of people you could ask this question to if you wanted to do a whole forum, right? But what it comes down to is finding a really cheap apartment. If you have a radically affordable apartment, $400, $600, whatever, something that a government $1,300 SSDI payment, which is would cover comfortably, you would not have as much homelessness, period. One of the things that was really shocking to me is, so this is what I always tell people. This is my little story. If anyone recalls the Tom Hanks movie Big, which is, if I'm sure everyone remembers, but it's this guy and he goes to this machine and he's a 12-year-old kid and then he's all of a sudden. And he comes home after this, mystical thing happens to him, and he's Tom Hanks. He's no longer the 12-year-old kid. And his mom freaks out and he has to go find somewhere to stay. Because he can't stay at his friend's house, because why would you bring like a 30-year-old home if you're 12? And so they go to New York, but they're like 12, right? So they have like $10 and they don't have any money really. I mean, they have like their piggy bank. And they go to this terrifying hotel where they have to give them the sheets. There's no bathroom, only a bed in the room. They have to use the communal bathroom, and he hears gunshots and he starts crying and whatever. There used to be a ton of people who lived in SROs in New York, in Chicago, in San Francisco, and the Tenderloin. And when that type of housing existed, there wasn't that much homelessness. There were people who had very occasional work. Sometimes they had substance problems. It's not to say that these were super pleasant
No.
places to be, but they gave people a sense of freedom, and they were more sanitary. Although there is some question now about whether or not you want the bathroom to be communal, shared in the age of COVID. But my point is that when we had this type of housing, we did not have homelessness. And you look at all the homeless programs, and they're like, move people to Stockton or something, which is like, right?
Yeah.
And then you're like, well, is moving them to Stockton help? Or does the fact that they could find a $500 apartment there help?
Right.
What was the intervention that mattered?
Yeah.
And the intervention that seems to matter is like, how do you find like a $400 apartment?
A radically affordable place, yeah.
So I just, one thing I say to people, which is really hard, but it's true, it's almost like we need more bad neighborhoods. Like people would go to the Tenderloin back in the day and be like, oh man, this is like a scary neighborhood or something. But if you could imagine 3 more of those and no homelessness, would that be preferable to what we have today? Yeah. And so I do sometimes think that we need to, anyway, I say it that way just as a sales pitch. It's, it's kind of, but I'm just saying, like, we need radically affordable apartments, and until we get there, so.
Well, I'm mindful. So the last question of the day, our discussion is going to go is coming from Lindsay Crane, who I think asks the perfect question here to wrap things up. Did you see any innovative or successful examples here or globally for businesses or the private sector to consider as ways to contribute to solutions?
So, the short answer is, well, so lots of ways, right? But they're all different, like, I guess what I would say at a very high level is just be involved in the process, in your local government. One thing I'm really skeptical of is when people say, oh, Google should pay for all the housing in Mountain View, or, right. And it's not that maybe Google's taxes should be much higher. Maybe they should pay a head tax. Maybe whatever. I mean, whatever, there's some appropriate level of taxation. Maybe we're below that. I'm totally open to that. Maybe your sponsors aren't, but
don't get me in trouble, Conor. Come on.
Well, I'm getting myself in trouble.
Yeah.
But whatever that level is, I think that there are certain problems that the government should be handling, and I think other people should be participating in them and paying for them. But I don't like this idea that we should all just be waiting for Google and Apple to be, paying for things. But I think that may mean, having head taxes or other things that recognize their impact on the size of the community they're in, or whatever. I mean, I'm not, but also, so that's one thing. There have also been, I haven't dug too deep into this, but there's this group in Minneapolis, I think it's called Itasca or something like that, where they have these all these different people basically get behind a room, and it's like unions, business leaders,
cross sector.
They hash it out. They will seriously just be like, okay, what do we need to happen? And sometimes they go again. They think they really went against Tim Pawlenty, that old Republican governor, even though he's ostensibly a friend of business. Some of the business people are like, no, we need better funding for schools or whatever. So it was like this. I thought that was an interesting model. And then I guess, but just kind of the overall message I would say is just be involved and get involved, whether it's, again, maybe your government relations person or whatever. But one thing I think is kind of sometimes hard about these problems is that I think that people almost consider local government to be below them, or either be below them or be so overwhelming in its volume that they're not sure quite how to scale it. So, and that's kind of the premise of the book, right? Is that the way we decide where, how much, and at what cost we build housing in America is decided, a lot of that's decided by a million little city councils. And that's a local, national problem. When you start asking people how you can solve that, which is why I keep returning to the sociology thing, it's I don't know. There's only 2 ways, right? One is they change their mind, or 2, you kick it up a level of government, which is what's happening now in California, or that's the attempt people are having, right? Mm-hmm. So where that leaves me is like, I sometimes just think, you'll talk to a company and you'll ask them, why aren't you participating in this housing problem or whatever? And there's either two answers you get. One is like, basically, I can't deal with that. It's just too small for me to care about. Or I don't want to anger the city council in the city I'm located in, because then they're going to raise my property taxes. I mean, they don't say that, but that's certainly what they imply. Right. And so I would just say that it seems worth it to be involved in this local government, because it's hugely important, and that this is where change kind of happens. That if we solve this housing problem, I think our federal politics and some of the problems we have there will just, I think it will almost naturally flow from that. From all the work you would have to do to get there.
Right.
And you see this time and time again where, the advocacy groups that spring up to solve local problems, when a presidential campaign comes through 3, 4, 5 years later, they don't really build a ground game so much as they plug into the people who have, they build a little bit of ground, but they plug into those groups that are already doing things. And so the people who start kind of getting in and solving these problems basically become the problem solvers for a good many things. And so I guess I would say that realizing that the local, even if you're a very big business, realizing that the local problems where you are not below you.
Yeah, no, that's, I promise Conor was not a plant, but obviously the work that we do is trying to facilitate our members being involved in local government and engaging in things. We've got a comment that often the rules of local government engagement can be confusing, and it's hard to figure that out. And so we're going to try to just keep at it. So I am mindful we have come to the end of our time. If you haven't read it yet, but you have a copy, you should read it. If you don't have a copy yet, you should get one, and we can help you do that. I know that I haven't yet raved about you on Amazon, and anyone else should. We need to.
Thank you.
But anyway, I just thank you very much, Conor. There's so much more I'd love to talk to you about, but just wanted to thank our sponsors, and this will be put on the member portal of the East Bay Leadership Council once we're done here. So with that, we're done. Thanks, Conor.
Thank you so much.